afternoon, Mr. Doughty. Allow me to introduce ourselves. So my name is Tessa, and this is Tess. And we are two members of our school newspaper, the Lashot Update, who will be asking you some questions today.
Pleasure.
Okay, so just for some context on who we're interviewing. So Stephen Doughty is a Welsh Labour and Cooperative Party politician who served as a Member of Parliament for Cardiff South and Penarth, hopefully I pronounced that right, since 2012. With that we can begin the interview.
So primarily, we were really interested in what path brought you towards politics. Did a moment in your career really set in stone what you wanted to do?
So I was quite lucky when I was younger to have been exposed to sort of local politics. So my dad was actually a local councillor and a mayor and was very involved in community activities. He'd been a youth worker locally. So I'd seen what difference kind of both community activism and elected politics could make in a community. And I was very lucky actually to do some work experience when I was younger with my predecessor as MP. So when I was about 15 and to have been quite interested at a younger age. But I think it was probably actually through my involvement in different campaigns when I was younger that got me interested. I was very opposed when I was younger to fox hunting, and I was very in favour of animal rights and action on the environment and climate and so on. And those things kind of stuck with me. And then you start asking the questions about how are the policies actually made and so on. And that probably got me into it from quite a young age. But probably after that, it was other experiences I had, both at school and at university, and then in the humanitarian sector in which I worked. You fundamentally sort of, in the end, have to come back to why are political leaders taking certain decisions, why are laws being made in some ways, why are policy decisions being taken, and that sort of leads you into wanting to be involved in that process yourself.
Yeah, okay. Really interesting. So Mr. Tyner kind of introduced that you primarily worked in a charitable foundation. So how was the transition from charity work to politics? How was that different?
So in the end, it's all politics with a small p, because it's all about change, it's all about how decisions are made. And my roles in the humanitarian organisations were advocating for change, either by organising campaigns or putting pressure on politicians or putting pressure on them through the media, getting people to write to their politicians, lots of issues. And then I'd spent some time in government on the opposite side of the fence, being pressured by those very people. So for me, it was quite a natural sort of transition, but you know, it is different being on the other side of the fence. I think the biggest difference is that when you're working in a single issue organisation, or at least a kind of a thematic organisation, that's what you're focused on.
Yeah.
As a elected representative, you have to be interested in everything, because your constituents, or indeed the country, might be interested in something that you don't necessarily have particular background or expertise on, and yet you need to learn and inform yourself.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so now the questions will be more around the talk that you gave earlier. So you mentioned that sometimes you had to make the decision to vote against your own party. Do you think that your own personal views are often different from the ones of your own party, and how do you find common ground between the two?
So fundamentally, my views are in line with my party. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in my party.
Of course.
So you know, if you're going to go into politics, you broadly have to ally yourself to one of the main parties, which broadly represents where you stand. And I've always been on the centre left of politics. I have particular views about the economy and public services and so on, which fit much more with my party, the Labour Party, and also its sister party, the Cooperative Party. So that's why I'm in it. But obviously, as you say, sometimes there are times when you disagree. More recently, that hasn't happened as much. I'm quite comfortable with the leadership and the direction of my party at the moment and the team, and that's why I'm serving as a shadow minister in that team, which means I have an additional responsibility of collective responsibility, not to differ from my party leadership. But previously I had some big disagreements with the position on some international issues, on some issues around Brexit, and that was very tough, and I had to make a tough decision at sometimes to break with my party and vote a different way.
Yeah. And were there any consequences to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can have sometimes minor consequences. You can be denied, a break, or you can be told you can't go on holiday, or you can, have an impact on your office, and lots of little things. But actually, it's more sometimes you would get grief, you get pressure and unhappiness from senior people, and that can be quite unpleasant at times.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think we've kind of been seeing recently a large separation, for example, in the economic gap between communities, and you discussed how in Cardiff there is a large discrepancy.
Yeah.
How do you ensure that both populations receive what they need, considering that what they do need is so different?
Yeah, in the end, people all need the same things. They need a roof over their head. They need basic public services. They need healthcare. They need education. They need food. They need their rights respected. So actually, what people need is the same. But we do, as you say, have big disparities, particularly in income and access to certain services. So the biggest challenges I see in my community are economic disparities. In terms of people really struggling to get by at the moment with the cost of living, particularly with energy prices rising, food prices rising, and yet their wages have stagnated or even gone down. And also, of course, many people lost jobs during the COVID pandemic as well. So that's a huge challenge, and many of those people are having to now rely on going to food banks or asking for emergency assistance. We get people in my office every week asking for that help. But I also see other disparities. So, for example, I see a lot of racial disparities in my communities. Discrimination against people from black and brown communities, from different religious communities, and so it's really important to understand those, and then also to obviously fight for changes to improve that, whether that's access to jobs or education or active discrimination that goes on, or in some cases even violence or worse.
Yeah. And how have you worked to reduce some of that discrimination, considering that your population has such different ethnic groups?
So on some of those disparities, I've worked with a lot of different organisations representing those communities. I try and make sure I listen to people from all those communities on a regular basis. I've tried to work with community organisations who are trying to support people. For example, I've worked with one of our local boxing clubs that does a lot of work with younger people who are a bit more disaffected from society, but also in that community predominantly come from the Muslim community or from the Black African community, and supporting them in their work is really important to me. In terms of income inequality, it's again supporting those kind of community organisations and resilience that's there. So I work with a community centre that supports elderly people with hot lunches a number of days a week, and also helped a lot of people during the pandemic delivering food to their homes, and similarly with food banks and an organisation locally that supports refugees and asylum seekers. So a lot of these services are being provided by the charity and voluntary sector, and having worked in that sector myself, I know how important they are, and I want to get alongside them. But I'm lucky that my local council, so my local municipal authorities, are run by my party. They take these things very seriously, and they've done some really brilliant work, for example, on homelessness, in terms of making sure there's a bed and a home available for everybody, and so nobody needs to be on the street in my city. There are some people because of more complex needs and issues, but they've invested in that, and that means that they're helped.
Yeah. Okay. So that kind of links on to the next thing I'm going to ask you about personal engagement. You often mention how that motivates you to campaign for certain issues such as Ukraine, HIV, LGBTQ plus rights. Do you think in order to fight well for an issue, one must be passionate about the matter, or can you fight for something that you are not necessarily 100%
That's a good question. No, I think you have to have passion, otherwise you shouldn't be in politics and you shouldn't be doing it. I think you the more passion, the more sort of personal sort of empathy and the emotion you can put into it, I think that really does help. But you do have to be careful not to let the emotion cloud the practicalities sometimes. That can be very difficult, particularly with really appalling situation. The situation in Ukraine is a classic one. I've got personal friends involved. I've got personal feelings about what's going on. And that can be very difficult when you've got to make difficult calls on what the policy should be or what you should be asking the government to do. So, for example, there's a lot of people calling for a no-fly zone at the moment. I've had Ukrainians come to me directly and ask for that, including Ukrainian MPs. But I don't think that's the right policy. I think it's extremely dangerous and could lead to even worse consequences. So we're trying to look at other ways that we can support without that policy. But that's tough because sometimes your head says one thing and your heart says something different, and you have to balance those things out.
Yeah. And would you say that, for example, LGBTQ plus rights, since you're obviously very close to the issue, would you say that sometimes that kind of makes it harder or maybe easier?
I think it really depends. For example, I've had people who don't know I'm gay and they make assumptions, say deeply homophobic or offensive things to me, and you have to decide whether you're going to react in that moment or whether you're going to take that situation and sort of de-escalate it and then but use it to achieve change, maybe in another way. I've had occasions where people have said things to me that are deeply concerning, but for various reasons at that moment you don't want to explode in anger or otherwise. Perhaps it's a diplomatic event, you don't want to cause offence, so on. But there are ways of dealing with it afterwards. I can think of a number of examples of that recently, and you just have to pick your moments sometimes, rather than just kind of leading with your, sort of immediate reaction. So.
So considering the devastating situation that's going on in Ukraine right now, a lot of countries have kind of reacted, but what do you think a country's role and duty is taking a step further to help Ukraine and obviously...
I mean, I think there's a number of key things at the moment. I mean, firstly, it's absolutely right that a huge coalition of countries have come together to condemn what Russia has done under Putin. And I mean, I think it's really important to be clear that it's not about the Russian people, because many of them don't agree with what he's doing either. This is him and his regime. So it's important that people have stood up against that they've stood alongside Ukraine, that they've taken really tough action on sanctions, and it's important that I've been working a lot on the sanctions issue. It's important that as many countries work together in the toughest ways possible, because otherwise they find gaps to get through.
Yeah.
And the second thing, obviously, is in the support of military assistance and so on. There are many things that we can do rightly to enable Ukraine to defend itself without getting involved in a sort of a NATO-Russia direct confrontation. And it's absolutely right what the UK has been doing, and that we agree with the government what they've been doing on that, which is, we have disagreements with the government on lots of things, but we think that's the right thing. And the third thing, of course, is humanitarian access and aid and medical support and humanitarian support. Some really horrific scenes in the last few days, particularly from Mariupol and elsewhere. And while I'm here in Geneva, I'm actually meeting a number of the humanitarian organisations and others to understand what work they're doing on the ground, because there's a lot of concerns about what is and isn't getting in and how people are being helped or not.
Yeah. Thank you. So this has kind of nothing to do with what we were talking about, but you mentioned in your talk that face-to-face contact with citizens is kind of important in the way that you work. Did you find that COVID-19 restrictions had a severe impact on your interactions with the people, and what consequences did this have on the long run?
So it did, and I think face-to-face contact is really, really important. There are some things that can only be done through spending time with somebody and getting to really know them and picking up on all of those body language signals and what's really going on and so on. That's quite important, particularly with complex cases. Like a doctor, MPs often have people present in a surgery, we call them surgeries as well, with one thing, but you actually find out that beneath it there's 2 or 3 other things that need to be dealt with. So that's quite hard to pick up in an online context. But what the online has done is it's actually made some things quicker, easier. The fact now that everybody knows how to use Zoom and Teams and things, whereas before people would have gone, I can't possibly do that. Actually, for some of my international work, it's been really good as well, because you can have a meeting with somebody quickly without travelling to see them. It's still not a substitute for face-to-face diplomatic contact. I think it's really important we get back to that. So actually on a constituency level and an international level, there have been huge impacts. But I think, hopefully we've learned what works well in terms of the technology and can kind of incorporate that now into day-to-day life.
Okay, thank you.
So do you think that, this is kind of also gearing off track, but obviously being a politician comes with a lot of hardships as well. So do you think that motivations, goals, and aspirations are a key aspect of being a successful politician?
I think they're really important, because if you don't have them, sometimes it can be quite bleak and quite difficult. And particularly when some of the more extreme things that have happened in British politics in the last few years, and I mentioned 2 colleagues who've been murdered, a lot of us have had a lot of threats, that can be very difficult to deal with at times. And even if you're the most resilient person in the world, I've been sent a fake bomb, I've been threatened with being killed, I've had a homophobic assault. These things, no matter how resilient a person you are, they do affect you, and they make you question why you're doing it and so on. So if you didn't have those purposes and impacts that you want to have, then I think it would be even more difficult. But politics shouldn't be like that. And actually, we don't want to see people put off. I know people who are put off coming into politics because they are worried about the impact it'll have on them. I mean, not just those extreme situations, but the hours are very family unfriendly. You have to travel a lot. I mean, I spent half my life in my constituency and half life in London. That's quite difficult for relationships, for friendships, family, all of those things. But we choose to do it. So it's not like somebody forcing us to do it.
Yeah.
So, you know, you have to accept that as part and parcel of the job, and we get paid well, and, you know, so it's about balancing those things together.
I think that's all
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah,
Ah.
me too.
Thank you so much.
Great, pleasure,
Thank you.
pleasure. Thank you very much.